All right, good morning. Let's get started with monitoring our POs in Intacct. So I'll be spending a little bit of time on the slide deck today, and then we'll get into Intacct and go through some of the reports that we can use to help keep an eye on our purchase orders and when we need to close them. So the slide deck I'm using, I'll make sure to send out a link to it after the session, and I'll make sure and send a link of this session also, as it will be recorded. If you have questions as we go through this, use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we can answer those as we go through. So let's get into the agenda. We're going to be going through our encumbrances or commitments, when they're created and when they're released. That's important to know when we're trying to find out why we still have an encumbrance balance on our reports. And then we're going to go through a few different report options that we can use to look for our encumbrances. In the registration form, I asked how people are using or what reports they're using to monitor their encumbrances, and the financial report is probably the most popular one, with the custom views at the purchasing screens, probably the next one. So we'll spend a few minutes going through those, and also through the dimension balance report and purchasing transaction detail report. And if you haven't had an opportunity to see those, this might be something you can use. So let's look at this and how our commitment's created. It's from one of these types of transactions. We're going to create our encumbrances by preparing a standard purchase requisition, a contract services requisition, indirect cost voucher requisition, a travel request, or a confirmed vendor amount, which is originated from the travel request vendor payment. And in any time any of these are fully approved, that's when the encumbrance begins. That's when the encumbrance will show up on our financial reports and appear on our general ledger reports. To the left of the big gray box, I have what journal entry happens once the encumbrance is created. After full approval, our expense line is debited and encumbrance control account is credited. And that's once any of these transactions are approved. So when these are approved, the types of statuses we might be looking at on the purchasing screen, where we can list or view our transactions. If we have purchase requisitions that are converted or pending, that's a signal to us that we've created an encumbrance or that transaction has. Same thing for contract service requisitions. If they're converted or pending, that means an encumbrance was created from that transaction. Indirect cost, we might see pending or partially converted. Travel request, pending and converted, and the same thing for confirmed vendor amounts, converted or pending, also tells us an encumbrance has been created. So we know how they're created. How do these things get released? It requires an action of some sort, whether it's preparing a voucher for payment, a justification workflow, as long as that came from an existing purchase order, since we can also create a justification as a standalone transaction. We reconcile our travel, or if we didn't go, a canceled trip is processed. Or lastly, if we have an open purchase order or an open contract service purchase order, we're not going to use it, or it was a blanket purchase order that still has a balance we're not going to use, we would convert that to a closed partial purchase order to close out the available balance from the purchase order. And just like creating an encumbrance, getting those released requires full approval. Just submitting a voucher doesn't release the encumbrance, or preparing our justification, travel rec, cancel trip. None of those things happen until they're fully approved. And so I've got the journal entries here on the left, which then the opposite happens for the encumbrance release, where now the encumbrance control account gets debited and the expense account using the encumbrance journal gets credited, moving that balance either to zero or reducing the balance depending on how much encumbrances you have. So those transactions, we see a voucher where the status is closed, justification is closed, travel rec is closed, canceled trip is closed, or closed partial POs are closed. Those are transactions that have occurred that would have released an encumbrance. If they say something like submitted partially approved, declined, draft, then we would know that they haven't released the encumbrance that they're tied to yet. So we'll look at our purchasing list screen when we get into Intacct and go through that. So why are encumbrances still open if we're expecting to see no balances on our financial reports? Number one, just what we've gone through. Our purchase orders or contract service purchase orders are pending, partially converted, draft or in progress. Vouchers, justifications, travel recs, or cancel trips are not fully approved yet. Our closed partial POs might be dated for an incorrect period, creating unbalanced entries. And what that means is, like, at the end of the year, September 30th is the end of the tribe's fiscal year. If it's now October and we're closing purchase orders from fiscal year 22, and we don't use a date for 9/30, the encumbrance will be released in the new fiscal year 23. So on your financial report, it'll look like it's still there, but if we ran a financial report for fiscal year 23, the credit would be there. So as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, those dates are important. If you have a fiscal year that doesn't match with the tribes, like the most recent would be Head Start had a fiscal year ending March 31st. If they're closing purchase orders and need to accrue to match that fiscal year, they would be dating that from March 31st instead of May 25th. And the same thing can be said for our vouchers, justifications, travel recs, cancel trips, if they're dated for an incorrect period, creating unbalanced entries. So if we travel in September and we're not reconciling until October, we want to make sure that we do accrue that to the fiscal year 22 and use the 9/30 date. Same thing with our payments, vouchers, and justifications. And the last two bullet points are about things not being converted correctly. Every so often, someone will open a purchase requisition and set it up like a blanket purchase order with a dollar value in the quantity field. And then when they convert it to a purchase order, won't bring the full dollar amount. They use the amount that they're trying to pay. And then that leaves the unconverted amount still sitting at a purchase rec. So it might look like we've done all the stuff we're supposed to do. We've converted our purchase requisitions. We've converted our purchase orders. Our stuff is all approved, but we still have an encumbrance out there. It could be related to something like this, which is a little more complicated to find. But that's one of the other things we'd be looking at if you were asking questions about why an encumbrance is still on your financial report. So let's get into Intacct. So the most common way I think that we've seen for answers is someone runs a financial report and that's how we see we have an encumbrance balance. So that's what we're going to start with. So I'm using a demo account, a demo user. So this has the same level of access as pretty much the majority of our users. So any report or whatever I'm doing on screen, anyone should be able to do. So in a regular environment, we might be running the fiscal year 1 funding source view report. So I've got this report queued up through today. So it's going to be, we know this is going to report on fiscal year 22 activity. And this report is going to bring up that we know the column next to budget lists our open encumbrances, which is great for us. We can see we have these obligations out there. We can use this as the basis to either make future purchasing decisions or know that, hey, our utilities line still has $485 encumbered, which also means, of course, it's reducing our budget availability. And if we needed to make a move on either paying an old utility bill from the open purchase order, or we're wanting to close our encumbrances now, we'd have this list and we know what we have to look for. It's great to get our balances, but this report can be difficult in finding out where these encumbrances come from. right? We're not told what purchase order or anything that it's tied to. We can click on the dollar amount if we're using the one funding source view reports. These reports become drillable if they have the blue hyperlink. So if I click that 485.58, it's going to take us to the general ledger report for that line item and every encumbrance transaction related to that. So as I scroll through, it's maybe 100 different types of transactions, where there's been $23,000 in requisitions and $22,000 in releases of those encumbrances. And we need to find $485. If there's a lot of activity here, like we see with this, that might be difficult for us to find the one or two transactions that might be creating this. So while the financial report does a good job giving us the summary information about our budget, it might not give us the information we're looking for on finding out exactly what it is that's creating this encumbrance. The second most popular thing that people rely on, and which is a really good thing, is the purchasing list screen. So if we go to purchase orders, we'd have a list of all the purchase orders. Like in this account right now has access to 307 purchase orders. If we have access to more than one funding source, it might be difficult to tell which fund is for which encumbrance, which open PO. So we know we'll be looking for pending or partially converted purchase orders. So if I use the state and I wanted any state that starts with the letter P, we've moved that 307 down to 12, so a little bit more manageable for what we're looking for. We're looking for utility lines, so judging by the names of the vendors here, we certainly know that it's going to be in the neighborhood of these three transactions. So we'd be a lot closer on that $483 mark or $485 mark from our financial report. This got us the balance. Right here now we're getting into the actual transactions, and we can start viewing the transactions to make a determination what we need to do. In the accounting manual, other than blanket purchase orders, we have to be closing our open purchase orders at least every 60 days. So if we're not using them, 60 days has passed, we should be making an effort to find those encumbrances and then take the appropriate action with them to close them if we're not going to use them. So now that we have this purchase order open to Little Creek, we can see the PO number, the requisition it was created from. Here's the account information. I ran that report on this program, funding source and checkbook. Here's that utility line. It was a $400 blanket purchase order. We know that because the quantity field has that value. And then now next to it, because we've used it, we get a quantity converted. So we know we've converted from this $400, $127.62, probably for payments, right? Which leaves that difference still open and ready to use for future bills, or in this case, roughly $283. If it's an encumbrance that we're not going to use anymore, that $283 would be part of this $485 encumbrance. If we're not using it anymore, we need to close this purchase order. One, we don't need to have it showing as an obligation anymore. That's not accurate or correct anymore in our financial report. And then number two is that encumbrance, while open, reduces our available budget, this balance here. And so if we're trying to figure out why we can't submit a new request because of budget issues, we need to focus on those open encumbrances. So if we need to close this purchase order, we've decided we've used all of this. If maybe this said October, November, December instead of April, May, June, we're going to close this now. We're finished with these 3 months of payments. We didn't use the whole thing. We know blanket purchase orders remain open until that quantity is fully exhausted, which we can see it's not. But now from inside here, we can go to close the purchase order and post that if we were going to close it. And then on the close partial PO thing and the dates, whatever the current day is, that's going to autofill right here on the date screen. So if we were past fiscal year 22 and we're in 23, this is where we're going to have to go and manually change that date to make sure we accrue that close to the correct fiscal year. And with the idea here that there's more than one funding source that's possible here because of the access to this account, and many of you have more access to more than one funding source. This doesn't give us the option to be able to list any of the stuff from our line entries in the views. We can only pull from these two sections up here, the header parts. So we can't dial into just that one funding source. So I would suggest that if you're not using like say the message field, which is probably not a very frequently used field, if we have our funding source, we're building our request, copy that funding source and put it in the message field. You can even put in your line item, like if we were using office supplies. Or attorney fees, I guess, since this one is what that has. So we can put that there. The message field becomes something we can list on those purchase screens. So as we're going through and we're doing that, we can then, from that list view, a little bit more easily sort out what we're looking for from our financial reports and not have to click and view too many transactions if that's what it comes to. So I ran this fiscal year report, which is a great report if we're only looking for the fiscal year. A lot of us, though, we have grants and contracts that last multiple years, which means we're probably looking at a life-to-date report because we might have things that branch through multiple fiscal years. On the report center, instead of using a fiscal year report, unless you're keeping up with your purchase orders so that you're only using them year to year, you might have to run a life-to-date report. Which for many of you already know that if we run the report directly on screen, the size of the report, because how long we've had Intacct, might take too long on screen to run. And causing it to time out and causing frustration because you're sitting here with your computer trying to build this report. If you're having to run that report, and you're going to use life to date, the best option for you is to use a process and store. You can go over here to more actions, process and store. And this account has access to the roads program. So if we were building our report here, program checkbook funding source, what as of data we're going to use, are we wanting all this for the life of this funding source through today? And we can leave the as of date here. If I want this report to run on June 1st, I can say I want it to run on June 1st, so I'm kind of scheduling a report for myself if that's the case. Otherwise, if I leave it for today, it's going to run for today, then we'll get an email when the report's ready. So I've got this information. I'm going to store it in Intacct. And then what option do you want to use? HTML, printable, CSV, or Excel? If we're doing budget mods or just wanting the report, printable is PDF, so that's more than likely the most common one we're using. Click OK, and we get the message it's being processed. Check your stored reports for the report results. That's at the top of the screen above more actions. There's view stored reports. And from here we can see history of when I've ran reports on other days. And then we see right now it says in process, which is the one I've just now ran. Once that's ready, it'll change to a blue hyperlink that says PDF. In your user preferences, under the email notification section, there's a checkbox for stored reports are generated and available. If you use this and want to be notified by email when the report becomes available, make sure that's checkboxed and click Save. That way, when you run the reports, Intacct will let you know when it's available, and you don't have to keep going back and checking. Depending on the size of the report, it might take a few minutes, or it might take 15 or 20 minutes instead. All right. Another report we can use, as we do that, I just got the email from Intacct that the report's ready. So here's what the report would look like. Dear user, your life-to-date expense funding source report is completed processing successfully. And it's directing me to the My Stored Reports to find that report. So if we go back to the Report Center to view stored reports, it's changed from an in process to a blue link for PDF. Now the report's available. All right. Another option we have now, besides the financial reports, or going to the purchase orders and looking for pending, partially converted, or to vouchers to look for what hasn't been approved yet, is we can go to the general ledger dimension balance report to look for our encumbrances also. And this is going to require a lot of input from you. Unlike the financial report, we're just telling it a day, program, funding source, checkbook. Here we have a lot of customization or telling Intacct what we need. It defaults to current month, so if you're looking at just current month activity, then you don't need to change anything. But if we're looking for our open encumbrances, we probably want to use a period that matches the funding source we're using. So if we're using a multi-year contract, I might be looking for inception, which same thing as life to date. Now we have to decide here, the accrual book is where all of our expenses and revenues are posted. If we're looking for encumbrances, we're going to have to use this other book option. So I can hit select, I'm going to add encumbrances. If I don't want our expenses mixed with our encumbrances, then we're going to uncheck that because we don't want to combine the reporting books. So now we have just encumbrances. We're going to select the actual data for encumbrances. What account numbers are we going to select? You can choose one, a range of accounts. If we wanted multiple accounts, so say we were looking for travel and office supplies, then we can select just those two if we wanted to report on just those two accounts. Or we can hit all. So up to you, the variety of stuff we can use from this screen. If we did a range and we weren't sure of all the accounts, we just want to make sure all our expenses are put in, I might start with the lowest expense number, which is a number that's going to start with a 5, and go to the highest expense number, which is going to start with a 9. So this means every account that's going to have activity that falls within this range is going to show up on this report. What is our program and checkbook? For users, that's our minimum required information on all of our reports. So we have that put there. If I don't specify a funding source, that means any funding source that is assigned to roads and checkbook 42, all of those funding sources would come up in this report. Or I can specify just the one. So if I specify just the one we were looking at on the life-to-date report, I've got that selected. If there was a certain vendor we're using, we can input that here, or leave it blank if we want all vendors to come back with this information. And then finally, how do we want this report to display? It remembers the last time you used the report, so it'll have those selections. If you haven't used it before, it's probably just going to say this, show dimension values and select. On this dimension balance report, we do have to have a selection. So what do we want to see on this report? We probably want to know the account ID and name for any of the open encumbrances, right? And then how do we want to present this information? Cascaded, side by side. With the one funding source, neither of these things really matter It matters once we have more than one dimension to show. So let's leave that there. We got account ID, now we can view. So this report runs, I didn't need to run a life-to-date report to get my encumbrance balances for that funding source and those two account numbers. And you can see Inception and Intacct spans 14 years right now, starting from when we got Intacct and going through September 2030. So that more than enough covers the life of all of our funds. And it just takes a few seconds to be able to do that. If we wanted to include our vendors here, now we can kind of start zeroing in like from our financial report and the purchasing view and start to make this report more powerful. We can come back to the screen and say, after the account number, I also want to see the vendor. You have a choice of name, ID, or vendor ID and name. Typically, I like to use the ID and name. So now if I rerun this report, doesn't take very much longer than running it the first time. Now we have the vendors included with each of the account numbers listed on screen. It's now, if we had a lot of open purchase orders, we know to go back and look for CHS, anything that's pending or partially converted for a purchase order, or maybe we have a voucher that's not fully approved or declined that we need to find. We know what we're looking for now on our purchasing screens. If we have more than one funding source that we think might have activity, instead of having the funding source field filled in, I might leave that blank so that any funding source under roads and checkbook 42 will show up. But one thing we want to make sure to do is I don't have funding source selected here, which means if I view this report, so it looks like it's just going to be the one funding source that has activity. If more than one funding source had activity and we don't list the funding source, it's going to combine that on this screen. So what we want to make sure to do while we're here is include the funding source ID if we want to see multiple funding sources listed. So I might get rid of this and then start and say I want the funding source ID to be first on the report, then the account, and then the vendor. And now there's that funding source. And if more than one fund had encumbrance balances, they would both be listed on screen separately. And as a bonus for this report, you can also run your financial report through here. Doesn't look quite the same, but it gets you the same information. So if we combine accrual and encumbrances, and we're going to select actual and budget, because now we want our budget information. We use the RST budget, so not any of the drafts. If we're going to continue to report on just our expenses, then I'm going to leave that alone. I'm just going to let that sit there. Let's pick that one funding source. And we don't budget to vendors, so I'm not going to include the vendor on this. So now we've got funding source ID, account ID and name, roads, checkbook 42, here's that funding source. Our accrual book and encumbrances are selected and being combined to see the actual and budget. And now we get an option to compare our budget. Do we want to see a difference column? In other words, the available balance. So now I click to view that. The life to date report just takes a few seconds to run on screen. And now we have our budget line by line. And then here's where we start to have a line item with our budget, our expenses, and the differences all through there. The only thing that's different really about this than the financial report is this column here combines both our expenses and our encumbrances. But if you're just looking for financial information like your available balances, or you want to use this for your budget mods, then that's just going to take you a few seconds to do. All right, so with the roads department in mind, let's go to the last report we're going to look at. And this kind of combines all of this stuff together. This is our financial report, this dimension balance report, and the purchasing list view all together at once. So we're going to go to the report center. And we're going to look for a report called Purchasing Transaction Details. So I'm going to just use the search bar and start typing, and it's going to start matching what I'm typing. And it's going to be this report. If you've ran the report before, you can also go to Purchasing Custom Reports and have that listed right there. If you have the report as a favorite, then you can go up here to your favorites and find that too. So a lot of ways for you to get to the report. But we're going to Purchasing Report Center, started typing our report name, and we get down to that. So similar to the dimension balance report, we have kind of all the same fields here. What's the period of time we're going to look at? This defaults to the fiscal year through whatever date we're running this report. So we're running it today, so today's date's filled in. If we're running a life to date, we want all the activity. Then we're going to look for inception. We have that. What is our checkbook? Our program and our funding source. And again, you can leave the funding source blank if you wanted it for all. If you have access to more than one checkbook, like if we're like LEAP has access to more than one checkbook, my access doesn't have that, but you could type in your program LEAP here, and then checkbook, use all checkbooks. And that would give you the combination of all your funds that's going to have activity using this report or that dimension balances report, the show all funding sources reports, that kind of stuff. So we're going to be specific here. Is there a vendor we're going to research? CHS was one, so let's use CHS as the vendor. If we know what line item we're looking for, we can use that here. I don't remember the line item, so let's leave that blank, which means any line item with activity might come up here on screen. And the last thing we can tell it, if we don't select anything here, then that means every transaction over the life of these funds involving CHS is going to come up. So let's click view, and then we'll come back and see what happens when we pick stuff. So we get a list of every time this funding source has used CHS. We can see the purchase orders, the purchase order numbers, its status, what they were valued at, the line items they were using, the dates of those transactions, and even a link to those purchase orders. We got the purchase requisitions, and we have vouchers. So we've got a lot of information. As we scroll through, this fund wasn't used a whole lot for CHS, so we can see a lot of closed, a lot of converted, but we do see that one pending. And from that dimension balance report, $9,000 was one of the encumbrances we had for CHS. But we know that by running this report ties to this purchase order. And for those of us who have access to multiple funding sources, we've bypassed having to click into multiple purchase orders. And we ran it right to here. Now we have a link to that purchase order that we can follow and then start taking whatever action we need to get this taken care of, whether it's paying the bill or closing the purchase order. I have the screen zoomed in a little bit, so it's harder to see how big the report is, but as we scroll to the right, we also get what the quantity said, how much of it's been converted, what's remaining, and then the original transaction it's tied to. So we know, scrolling through this, none of these were blanket purchase orders because the quantity was 1 and the total is $9,000. If it was a blanket purchase order, we might see 9,000 here instead, and then what was converted from that and what was left of that. So another easy way to check on our blanket purchase order balances. If we're going to run this report and we don't want all that activity, we just want specifically our open purchase orders. Right here under this section, purchasing info, we can choose the transaction type. So if I'm looking for purchase orders, I could scroll through until I find purchase order. And then what status do I want to use to find purchase orders that are still open? So we might be looking for something that's pending or partially converted. We could also use in progress because this would give us any vouchers that are in draft mode. So the purchase order is kind of in limbo because of that. So these three things would tell us there's purchase orders waiting for our action. So if I ran it with those in mind instead of nothing input for the purchases, now I don't have all the other lines to clog up the report. I just have the one that's important to me, which is the pending purchase order. And you can do that for any of the transaction types on the report. We can only pick one transaction type. So you could come through here and look for your purchase orders or your contract service purchase orders. Or if you just wanted anything that's pending, partially converted, or in progress without including the purchase type, you can do the same thing. Which fortunately for this fund is just the one transaction for CHS. If I didn't include a vendor, but still included these purchasing states and not specifying a purchase, now we've added the other open purchase order to this account with this vendor. And then, of course, running this report, just like the dimension balance report, is a lot faster than waiting for a financial report to pop up. Could be a lot faster than using the purchasing screen where your purchase orders are and then having to click and open each one looking for the one that goes to your funding source. This actually takes us there and gives us the link to the document. So if I click on that, it now takes us to the PO, so we can either research it more, make a decision, and then decide what we need to do on paying it or closing it. All right, I didn't see any questions come in through here. So hopefully the review of this report purchasing transaction detail was good enough. If you're not comfortable using this, the only way you're going to get comfortable is by actually putting it to use and going through trial and error if something isn't working out. Just because we get a response that says maybe nothing is found, it doesn't mean we've done anything wrong. We can check our filters to see. Are we using the right purchasing type or the right status, that kind of stuff. Double check. But you have to try and run this to make sure that you can run this when it's needed. The same thing with a dimension balance report. Since that requires a lot of input from a user, unlike the financial report, all up to you. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in, so thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.